In the kingdom of wolves, worth is measured not in gold, but in the sharpness of teeth and the strength of bone. Here, among the silver pine pack, an omega's value could be counted on trembling fingers, less than the scraps thrown to starving dogs, worth only what mercy the strong might spare. Aurelia Voss had learned this truth written in every dismissive glance, every whispered insult. Every night she went to bed with hunger gnawing at her belly while others feasted. She was the broken one, the girl whose wolf had never come, whose transformation had failed so spectacularly that even speaking of it brought shame to her bloodline. 5 copper coins. That was all she possessed in the world, the sum total of a life spent begging for acceptance from those who saw her as less than human, less than wolf, less than anything worth remembering. 5 copper coins, clutched in a palm made raw by desperation, while around her the market square buzzed with the casual cruelty of those born into power. They laughed at the foolish Omega, the pitiful creature who dared to dream that kindness might still exist in a world built on dominance and fear. But in a wooden crate, hidden beneath rotting canvas, something waited in the shadows, something small and broken and forgotten, marked as worthless by those too blind to see the truth burning behind eyes covered by rough burlap. A damaged wolf pup, they called it. Cursed goods, better left to die. What they couldn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that sometimes the greatest power comes wrapped in the humblest packages, that sometimes salvation arrives not in glory, but in silence, that sometimes 5 copper coins, spent with a heart full of hope rather than a fist full of greed, can purchase not just a life, but the destiny that will reshape the world. In 3 months' time, they would all understand. In 3 months' time, they would remember the day they mocked the Omega girl who saw worth where they saw only waste. In 3 months' time, the very foundations of their world would tremble beneath the paws of something they had dismissed as broken, and the quiet strength of the woman who had refused to believe that broken meant worthless. The transformation was about to begin. All it took was 5 coins and the courage to love a monster. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The market square reeked of desperation and unwashed bodies, a fitting backdrop for Aurelia's weekly humiliation. She clutched her last 5 copper coins so tightly they left impressions in her palm, the metal warm from her fevered grip as she surveyed the meager offering she could afford. Wilted vegetables that even the poorest families had rejected, bread so stale it could double as a weapon, scraps of meat that buzzed with flies and carried the sickly sweet stench of impending rot. This was what remained when the Omega was finally permitted to shop, the dregs, the refuse, the things deemed unworthy of anyone with actual status in the silver pine pack. Look what the wind blew in, sneered Cassandra, the beta's daughter, as she passed with her entourage of equally privileged she-wolves. Still pretending to be a real person, I see. Aurelia kept her head down, focusing on a potato that looked like it might last another day before sprouting eyes. Engaging with Cassandra only invited more cruelty, and she'd learned long ago that silence was her best defense against the casual malice of those born into power. I heard she's been stealing from the communal gardens again, one of Cassandra's friends whispered, just loud enough for Aurelia to hear. Pathetic, really, even for an Omega. What did you expect? Cassandra's voice dripped with false pity. Her bloodline's so weak, she can't even shift properly. More human than wolf, if you ask me. The words hit their target with practiced precision. Aurelia's hand moved instinctively to her chest, where the mark of her failed first transformation remained hidden beneath her threadbare dress, a jagged scar where her wolf had tried to emerge but found no strength to complete the change. She was 17 now, long past the age when most wolves achieved their full form, yet she remained trapped in this liminal space between human and shifter. Neither one thing nor another, belonging nowhere. 5 coins, she whispered to the vegetable vendor, a grizzled man whose sympathy extended only as far as his profit margin allowed. What can I get for 5 coins? He looked at her with something that might have been pity if it weren't so tinged with disgust. Not much, girl. Maybe some turnips from last week's harvest. Though I can't promise they're still good. Aurelia nodded, already reaching for her meager payment, when commotion at the far end of the square caught her attention. A traveling merchant had arrived, his cart overloaded with exotic goods that drew the wealthy like moths to flame. Rare spices from distant lands, fabrics that shimmered in the afternoon light, and in a separate section that made the crowd give it wide berth, animals, not pets or livestock, but something else entirely, creatures that carried the scent of wildness and magic, their eyes too knowing for simple beasts. The merchant called them curiosities, oddities collected from the far reaches of the continent, for those brave enough to pay his prices. Aurelia found herself drawn toward the display, despite knowing she had no business among such expensive offerings, but something pulled at her, an instinct deeper than common sense, urging her forward through the crowd of gawking customers. In the center of the animal collection sat a large wooden crate, roughly constructed and bearing several air holes that had been punched through with obvious haste. Unlike the other containers, which were designed to showcase their contents, this one seemed built to hide whatever lay within. A sign hung from its side, written in the merchant's flowing script. Wolf pup, damaged goods, 5 coins OBO. 5 coins. Exactly what she had. Aurelia moved closer, drawn by curiosity and something else she couldn't name. Through the gaps in the wood, she caught glimpses of gray fur and the edge of what appeared to be a burlap sack covering the creature's head. "Wouldn't waste your time with that one, miss," the merchant said, appearing beside her with the fluid grace of a natural salesman. His smile was sharp as broken glass, and his eyes held the calculating gleam of someone who made his living from others' misfortunes. "Poor things damaged beyond repair. Birth defects, most likely. Probably won't live through the week." "What kind of defects?" Aurelia asked, surprising herself with the question. Couldn't say for certain. Previous owner kept its head covered, claimed it was too disturbing to look upon. The merchant shrugged with practiced indifference. "I took it off their hands as a favor, really. Though I suppose even damaged goods might serve some purpose. Pet food, perhaps. Pet food." The casual cruelty of the suggestion made Aurelia's stomach turn. She looked through the slats again, trying to make out more details of the creature within. It was smaller than she'd expected for a wolf pup, with fur that seemed unusually thick and lustrous despite its apparent poor health. But it was the way it held itself that caught her attention. Not with the broken despair of an abused animal, but with a quiet dignity that spoke of intelligence and awareness. "Has anyone examined it properly?" she asked. "Removed the covering to see what's actually wrong?" The merchant's smile widened, scenting opportunity. "Brave little Omega, aren't you? Most folks won't go near it. Something about the smell puts people off, makes them uncomfortable." Aurelia frowned. She'd been standing next to the crate for several minutes and hadn't noticed any unpleasant odor. If anything, the scent that drifted from within was oddly appealing. Wild and clean, like pine forest after rain. "I'll take it," she said before she could reconsider. The merchant blinked in surprise. "I beg your pardon?" "The pup. I'll pay your asking price." "All 5 coins?" His tone suggested he thought she'd lost her mind. "For damaged goods you haven't even properly examined?" "All 5 coins," Aurelia confirmed, already counting out the copper pieces. A hush fell over the nearby crowd as word of the transaction spread. She could feel their stares, hear their whispered conversations about the foolish Omega wasting money on a creature that would likely be dead within days. But beneath their mockery, she sensed something else, an unease that made them step back from the crate, as if whatever lay within might somehow contaminate them through proximity alone. "Your funeral," the merchant said, but he was already snatching the coins from her palm with greedy fingers. "Though I'll give you some advice, free of charge. Don't remove that sack unless you're prepared for what you might find underneath." 20 minutes later, Aurelia was trudging up the hill toward her ramshackle cabin with the crate balanced precariously in her arms. The pup inside had remained silent throughout the journey, but she could feel its presence like a warm weight against her chest. Several times she'd caught glimpses of movement through the air holes, not the frantic struggles of a trapped animal, but the careful, measured movements of something conserving its strength. Her cabin sat at the very edge of pack territory, a one-room structure that had been abandoned for years before she'd claimed it as her own. The roof leaked in 3 places, the windows were cracked, and the door hung slightly askew on its hinges. But it was hers, bought with the meager savings she'd accumulated from years of menial labor, and it represented the closest thing to independence an Omega could achieve in the rigid hierarchy of pack society. Inside, she set the crate down on her small kitchen table and stepped back to study it properly. Up close, she could see that the wood was newer than she'd first thought, hastily nailed together as if someone had needed to contain its occupant quickly. The burlap sack over the pup's head was secured with rough twine, tied just loose enough to allow breathing, but tight enough to prevent the creature from working it free. "Hello," she said softly, approaching the crate with slow, deliberate movements. "I know you're probably scared. I would be too." Through the slats, she saw the pup's head turn toward the sound of her voice, not the mindless reaction of an animal, but the focused attention of something that understood her words on a level deeper than simple conditioning. "I'm going to let you out now," she continued, her hands moving to the latch that secured the crate's front panel. "I won't hurt you. I promise." The latch opened with a soft click, and the front of the crate swung down to reveal the creature within. Aurelia's breath caught in her throat. Even with the burlap sack obscuring its features, the pup was magnificent. Its fur was the color of storm clouds shot through with silver, thick enough to suggest excellent breeding despite its current circumstances. But it was the creature's bearing that truly struck her, the way it held its head high despite its restraints, the careful control evident in every line of its body. This was no ordinary wolf pup. "You're beautiful," she whispered, and meant it. The pup's head tilted at her words, and she caught a glimpse of what lay beneath the sack, eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that made her heart skip. Not the simple awareness of a smart animal, but something deeper, something almost human in its complexity. "I'm going to remove this," she said, her hands hovering over the twine that secured the sack. "But only if you'll let me. I won't force you." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the pup lowered its head in what could only be interpreted as permission. Aurelia's fingers trembled as she worked at the knots, her touch gentle despite her excitement. The twine was rough and had been tied tightly enough to leave marks in the creature's fur. When the last strand came free, she carefully lifted the sack away and found herself staring into the most extraordinary eyes she'd ever seen. They were gold, but not the simple amber of most wolves. These eyes held flecks of silver and copper, swirling together like molten metal, and in their depths, she saw an intelligence that made her gasp aloud. The pup was looking at her not as prey or predator, not even as another wolf might look at a packmate, but as an equal, as someone worthy of recognition and respect. "My God," she breathed. "What are you?" The pup didn't answer. Couldn't answer, she reminded herself, but something in its gaze suggested that it understood the question perfectly, and perhaps someday it might even provide an answer. For now, though, it was enough that she'd found him. Or perhaps, she thought with a shiver of prescience, he'd found her. Either way, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. "Are you hungry?" she asked, already moving toward her small pantry. "I don't have much, but we'll share whatever there is." As she prepared what little food she could spare, Aurelia found herself humming, something she hadn't done in years. For the first time since her failed transformation, she felt a spark of hope kindling in her chest. Maybe this was exactly what she'd needed. Someone to care for. Someone who might actually need her. Behind her, the wolf pup watched with those impossible eyes, and something that might have been gratitude flickered in their golden depths. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something far more dangerous, and far more wonderful, than either of them yet understood. The pup's first night in Aurelia's cabin passed without incident, though she barely slept. Every few hours, she found herself checking on him, drawn by an inexplicable need to ensure he was still breathing, still present, still real. He'd accepted the small bowl of water and scraps of bread she'd offered with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in the crate, eating slowly and methodically as if each bite was being carefully evaluated. By morning, she'd made several startling observations. First, the pup was far cleaner than any animal rescued from a trader's cart had any right to be. Despite days or possibly weeks of confinement, his fur showed no signs of matting or filth. If anything, it seemed to gleam with its own inner light, each strand perfectly aligned and lustrous. Second, he moved with a precision that spoke of excellent health, rather than the debilitating illness the merchant had claimed. There was no trembling in his limbs, no labored breathing, no signs of the birth defects that had supposedly made him unsellable. And third, most disturbing of all, he seemed to be growing. It was subtle, perhaps no more than an inch in height and a few pounds in weight, but Aurelia was certain the creature that greeted her that morning was larger than the one she'd freed from the crate. Not drastically so, but enough to make her question her own perceptions. "Good morning," she said, as she prepared her own meager breakfast. "Did you sleep well?" The pup, she really needed to think of a name for him, lifted his head from where he'd been resting by the fireplace and fixed her with that unsettling golden stare. Then, to her complete astonishment, he dipped his head in what could only be interpreted as a nod. Aurelia nearly dropped the wooden bowl she'd been holding. "Did you just—" She trailed off, studying his face for any sign that she'd imagined the gesture. "Do you understand me?" Another nod, this one more deliberate. Aurelia sank into her single chair, mind reeling. She'd heard stories, of course. Legends of wolves gifted with unusual intelligence, creatures that existed somewhere between animal and shifter. But those were fairy tales, myths told to entertain children, and romanticize the old days when magic supposedly ran stronger in the world. This, however, was sitting in her kitchen and nodding at her questions like the most natural thing in the world. "What's your name?" she asked, then immediately felt foolish. Even if he could understand her, he couldn't exactly answer. The pup tilted his head, considering the question with obvious seriousness. Then he rose and padded over to where she'd left some ash from the previous night's fire scattered near the hearth. Using his paw with careful precision, he began to draw shapes in the gray dust. Aurelia leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. The marks weren't random scratches or instinctive movements. They were deliberate, controlled, forming patterns that almost looked like letters, she whispered in amazement. "You're trying to write letters." The shapes were crude, obviously constrained by the limitations of working with a paw instead of fingers, but she could make out what appeared to be an L, followed by something that might have been a Y or U. The third mark was unclear, but the fourth was definitely an N. "Lynn?" she guessed. "Is your name Lynn?" The pup, Lynn, sat back on his haunches and regarded her with what she could only describe as approval. Then he returned to the ash and carefully added 2 more letters. "X. Lynx," Aurelia breathed. "Your name is Lynx." It was an unusual name for a wolf, but somehow it suited him perfectly. There was something feline in the grace of his movements, the calculating intelligence in his gaze, and like the great mountain cats his name evoked, he possessed an air of barely contained power that made her instinctively wary, even as she felt drawn to protect him. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, followed by a voice that made her blood run cold. "Aurelia, open up. We know you're in there." Marcus, the pack's head enforcer, Cassandra's older brother and the Alpha's personal attack dog. His presence at her doorstep meant trouble of the worst kind. Lynx was on his feet instantly, his entire body going rigid with tension. But instead of cowering or hiding as she might have expected from a young animal, he positioned himself between Aurelia and the door with the protective instincts of a trained guardian. "Stay quiet," she whispered, then raised her voice to address her unwelcome visitor. "I'm coming." She opened the door just wide enough to reveal her face, keeping her body positioned to block Marcus's view of the interior. He stood on her small porch with 2 other enforcers flanking him, their expressions uniformly hostile. "Marcus," she said, injecting as much calm into her voice as she could manage. "What can I do for you?" "We've had reports of theft," he said without preamble. Specifically, theft of pack property. Aurelia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "I'm not sure I understand. A valuable asset was sold yesterday to someone who had no right to purchase it." Marcus stepped closer, his bulk filling the doorframe. "The merchant has been persuaded to reveal the identity of the buyer." "I bought supplies at the market yesterday," Aurelia said carefully. "Food and necessities, all legally purchased with my own money, including a wolf pup that belongs to this pack." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known there was something special about Lynx, but if he truly belonged to the pack, why had he been abandoned in a trader's cart? Why hadn't anyone come looking for him before now? "I bought a sick pup from a traveling merchant," she said, sticking as close to the truth as possible. 5 coins for what he called damaged goods. If the animal belongs to someone else, I was never informed of it. Marcus's smile was cold as winter frost. "Ignorance isn't an excuse, Omega. The pup was stolen from Packlands 3 months ago. The merchant was merely holding it until we could arrange proper retrieval. 3 months. If that were true, then Lynx had been separated from the pack since he was barely weaned. But something about Marcus's explanation didn't ring true. Why would they use an outside merchant to hold stolen property? Why not simply reclaim it themselves? "I'd be happy to discuss compensation for any misunderstanding," she said carefully. Perhaps we could. The only compensation we require is the immediate return of pack property. Marcus pushed past her into the cabin before she could stop him, his enforcers following close behind. The small space suddenly felt impossibly cramped with 3 large men crowding into it. Aurelia backed toward the fireplace, where Lynx had been moments before. But when she looked for him, he was nowhere to be seen. "Where is it?" Marcus demanded, overturning her meager furniture with casual violence. "Where's the pup?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Aurelia said, though her eyes were frantically searching the cabin. How had Lynx simply vanished? There was nowhere to hide in the single room, no closets or cupboards large enough to conceal even a young wolf. "Don't lie to me, Omega." Marcus grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises. "We can smell it. It's been here recently." One of the enforcers, a brutal man named Kane, was examining the area near the fireplace where Lynx had written his name in the ash. "Boss," he called softly, "you need to see this." Marcus released Aurelia and strode over to where Kane was pointing. When he saw the letters traced in the dust, his face went white. "No," he breathed. "It can't be." "What is it?" the third enforcer asked. "What's wrong?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside the ash markings and studied them with the intensity of a man examining evidence of his own death sentence. When he finally looked up at Aurelia, his expression had shifted from cruel amusement to something approaching terror. "Where did you learn to write these symbols?" he demanded. "Those are letters," Aurelia said, confusion clear in her voice. "Lynx. It's a name." "No." Marcus rose slowly, his movements careful and controlled. "These aren't ordinary letters. Look at the formation, the specific curves and angles. This is old script, the formal writing system used by the ancient bloodlines." Ancient bloodlines. Aurelia felt ice forming in her stomach. She'd heard whispers of the old families, lichens whose heritage stretched back to the very origins of their kind, wolves whose power was so great that modern packs could barely comprehend their capabilities. But those were legends, stories told to frighten children and remind them of their place in the natural order. "You're saying the pup wrote those?" Kane asked skeptically. "I'm saying something wrote them that was taught by the old families." Marcus's voice was tight, with barely controlled panic. "And if that's true, then we've made a terrible mistake coming here." A low growl echoed through the cabin, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was unlike anything Aurelia had ever heard, deeper than any normal wolf could produce, carrying harmonics that spoke of age and power beyond mortal understanding. The 3 enforcers spun in circles, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it continued to emanate from all around them, as if the very walls were producing it. "We should go," Kane whispered. "Now." But Marcus seemed frozen in place, his face growing paler with each passing second. "If it's really one of them," he said to no one in particular, "if the old bloodlines have returned." The growl intensified, and suddenly the air in the cabin grew thick and oppressive. Aurelia felt a familiar presence settle around her like a protective cloak, and she realized with stunning clarity that Lynx hadn't disappeared at all. He was simply choosing not to be seen. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice carrying new authority. "All of you. Now." Marcus looked at her with something approaching respect for the first time in her life. Then he nodded to his men and headed for the door. "This isn't over," he said as he paused on the threshold. "Whatever you've stumbled into, Omega, it's bigger than you understand. And when the Alpha learns of this, he didn't finish the threat, but he didn't need to." The implications were clear enough. After they were gone, Aurelia sank into her chair and tried to process what had just happened. The air gradually returned to normal, and slowly, gradually, Lynx materialized near the fireplace, as if stepping out of shadow itself. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lynx patted over to where she sat and rested his large head against her knee. Through that contact, she felt something impossible, a warmth that seemed to flow directly from his mind to hers, carrying with it emotions and concepts that had no words: gratitude, protection, a promise that she would never face danger alone again. And underneath it all, a truth that made her heart race with equal parts terror and exhilaration. The creature she'd saved for 5 copper coins was no ordinary wolf pup. He was something far older, far more powerful, and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And now, for better or worse, he was hers. 3 weeks passed, and the changes in Lynx were impossible to ignore. What had begun as subtle growth spurts had accelerated into something that defied natural law. Each morning, Aurelia woke to find him noticeably larger, his frame filling out with muscle that spoke of careful breeding and ancient genetics. His coat had deepened from storm gray to something closer to charcoal shot through with veins of silver that seemed to move in the light like living mercury. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as something beyond ordinary. The gold had intensified until they gleamed like molten metal, and in their depths, Aurelia sometimes caught glimpses of intelligence so vast and ancient that it made her dizzy to contemplate. He was the size of a full-grown wolf now, despite being perhaps 4 months old at most. His shoulders reached nearly to her waist when he stood beside her, and his presence had begun to affect the very air around their cabin. Birds no longer sang in the trees near her home. Smaller animals gave the area a wide berth. Even the insects seemed reluctant to venture close, and Aurelia was running out of food. Her meager savings had been exhausted within the first week of feeding a rapidly growing wolf with an appetite that seemed bottomless. She'd begun skipping her own meals, giving Lynx the larger portions while sustaining herself on scraps and the occasional wild berry she could forage from the forest. It wasn't sustainable, but she couldn't bring herself to care. Every day with him felt like a gift, an impossible dream she was afraid would shatter if she examined it too closely. He had become her constant companion, her silent guardian, and increasingly, the center of her entire world. The communication between them had evolved far beyond simple gestures. Somehow, through methods she couldn't begin to understand, Lynx had learned to share his thoughts directly with her mind. Not in words, those still seemed beyond his current capabilities, but in images and emotions so vivid, they might as well have been speech. Through these mental exchanges, she'd learned fragments of his past. Glimpses of a massive stone fortress hidden deep in mountains she didn't recognize. Memories of other wolves with similar markings. Creatures of such power that reality seemed to bend around them. And always, running through every shared vision like a dark thread, the sense of loss and separation that spoke of family torn apart by forces too great for a young mind to comprehend. But he never showed her how he'd ended up in that trader's cart. Never revealed who had put the sack over his head, or why they'd claimed he was damaged goods. Those memories remained locked away, hidden behind walls of pain too deep for him to share. This morning, as autumn painted the forest in shades of gold and crimson, Aurelia sat on her front steps, watching Lynx patrol the perimeter of their small property. His movements had gained a predatory grace that made her breath catch, fluid as water, silent as shadow, radiating the kind of controlled power that spoke of elite breeding and careful training. She was so absorbed in studying him that she didn't notice the approach of visitors until they were already climbing the hill toward her cabin. Alpha Dominic strode up the path with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Behind him walked Marcus and 2 other enforcers, their expressions grim with purpose. But it was the woman beside the Alpha that made Aurelia's blood run cold. Elder Morgana, the pack's spiritual advisor and keeper of the old knowledge. Her presence here meant this was no casual visit. The elder dealt only in matters of life and death, prophecy and ancient law. Lynx appeared at Aurelia's side before she'd even realized he'd moved, his massive form radiating protective menace. The approaching group stopped 20 feet away, clearly unwilling to come closer while he stood guard. "Aurelia Voss," the Alpha called, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "By order of the Pack Council, you will surrender the creature in your possession for proper examination and disposal." Disposal? Aurelia rose to her feet, one hand resting on Lynx's broad head for comfort. "What are you talking about?" Elder Morgana stepped forward, her ancient eyes fixed on Lynx with an intensity that made the air around them seem to thicken. "Child, you have no understanding of what you've brought into our territory. That creature bears markings that should not exist in this age of the world. He's just a wolf," Aurelia said, though the words felt like lies on her tongue. "Look at him!" Morgana's voice cracked like a whip. "Look at the silver tracery in his fur, the pattern of markings across his shoulders. Those are the bloodline markers of House Valdris, a family that was destroyed 300 years ago for crimes against the natural order. House Valdris." The name resonated in Aurelia's mind like a bell struck in a vast cathedral. Through her connection with Lynx, she felt him react to the words with a complex mixture of recognition, pride, and deep abiding sorrow. "Even if that were true," Aurelia said carefully, "what does it matter? He's done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" Marcus laughed harshly. The Valdris bloodline was exterminated for good reason. They grew too powerful, too ambitious. They began to see themselves as gods among wolves, demanding worship and absolute obedience from lesser packs. They were tyrants, the Alpha added, his tone brooking no argument. Monsters who used their abilities to subjugate and control. When they were finally brought down, the entire supernatural community swore that their bloodline would never be permitted to rise again. Aurelia felt Lynx's emotional response to these accusations. Not anger or denial, but a profound sadness that spoke of truths more complex than simple condemnation. Through their bond, she sensed layers of history and betrayal, of power corrupted and noble intentions twisted into something dark. That was centuries ago, she said. Whatever his ancestors may have done, Lynx is innocent of their crimes. Lynx? Elder Morgana's eyes widened. You named him Lynx? There was something in the woman's tone that made Aurelia's skin crawl, a mix of horror and terrible understanding that spoke of prophecies fulfilled and ancient fears made manifest. What's wrong with that name? Aurelia demanded. In the old tongue, Lynx was the title given to the Valdris heir, Morgana whispered. The chosen successor who would inherit the full power of the bloodline when he came of age. If this creature has claimed that name, she didn't finish the sentence, but the implications hung heavy in the air between them. It changes nothing, Alpha Dominic said firmly. Valdris blood is poison in the world. The creature will be destroyed before it can reach maturity and claim its full inheritance. No. The word came out sharper than Aurelia intended, backed by a surge of protective fury that surprised even her. You won't hurt him. I won't let you. The Alpha's eyes narrowed. You forget yourself, Omega. You have no authority here. No power to defy pack law. Then change the law. Aurelia shot back. Or find a new Omega to intimidate. Because I'm done being afraid of you. The words hung in the sudden silence like a challenge thrown down between them. Aurelia felt as surprised as anyone by her own boldness, but the connection with Lynx seemed to be lending her strength she'd never known she possessed. Foolish girl, Marcus snarled, taking a step forward. You'll stand aside, or we'll move you aside. Lynx's response was immediate and devastating. He flowed forward like liquid shadow, covering the distance between them in a heartbeat. But instead of attacking, he simply positioned himself directly in Marcus's path and fixed the enforcer with a stare that seemed to bore straight through to his soul. Marcus stumbled backward as if he'd been physically struck, his face draining of color. His eyes, he whispered. Look at his eyes. Aurelia followed his gaze and gasped. Lynx's golden irises were glowing now, lit from within by some inner fire that made them appear almost molten. And in that supernatural light, she could see something impossible. Symbols. Ancient script flowing across his pupils like text written in liquid flame. The sight, Elder Morgana breathed. He's manifesting the Valdris sight. What does that mean? Aurelia asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. It means he can see the truth of things, Morgana explained, her voice heavy with dread. Past, present, and future laid bare before him, the deepest secrets of anyone who meets his gaze. It was this ability that made the Valdris bloodline so dangerous, and so feared. Alpha Dominic's hand moved to the silver blade at his belt, a weapon designed specifically for dealing with supernatural threats. All the more reason to end this now, before he grows strong enough to use such power against us. Lynx turned his blazing gaze toward the Alpha, and Dominic froze mid-draw. For long seconds, the two stared at each other across the space between them. Predator evaluating predator, power meeting power. Then something shifted in the Alpha's expression. Fear crept in around the edges of his confidence, followed by something that might have been recognition. Impossible, he whispered. You're supposed to be dead. We made sure. He cut himself off, but not before revealing far more than he'd intended. Aurelia felt the pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. You knew, she said. You knew what he was when Marcus came here 3 weeks ago. That's why you wanted him back. The pack has a responsibility, Dominic began. You were involved in what happened to his family, Aurelia continued, her voice rising with fury. That's why he was in that traitor's cart. You put him there. The Alpha's silence was confirmation enough. Through her bond with Lynx, Aurelia felt a surge of memory so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Images flooded her consciousness. A massive stone keep burning under a moonless sky. wolves in human form wearing the insignia of multiple packs working together to destroy everything they found. And in the center of it all, a small pup being torn away from his dying mother and loaded into a cart by traders paid to dispose of the evidence. "You monsters," she breathed. "He was just a baby. They all were. They were abominations," Marcus snarled. "Creatures whose very existence threatened the balance of nature itself." "No," Aurelia said, understanding flooding through her with crystalline clarity. "They were threats to your power. The old bloodlines didn't bow to modern pack structure, did they? They remembered when wolves were more than what you've made them into." Elder Morgana stepped forward, her expression grave. "Child, you understand nothing of the forces you're meddling with. The Valdris bloodline was destroyed for the good of all our kind. If this creature reaches maturity, if he claims his full inheritance, the supernatural world will burn." "Good," Aurelia said simply. "Maybe it's time." The words surprised her even as she spoke them, but she meant every syllable. Looking around at the terrified faces of the pack leadership, she realized that her entire life had been spent serving a system designed to keep her powerless and afraid. They called her Omega, as if it were her name, as if her worth as a person could be reduced to a single word that defined her place at the bottom of their hierarchy. But standing here with Lynx at her side, feeling the incredible power that radiated from him like heat from a forge, she understood that there were other ways to live, other definitions of strength and value that didn't depend on the approval of those who saw her as less than human. "You will surrender the creature," Alpha Dominic said, his voice taking on the commanding tone that compelled obedience from pack members. "That is not a request." Aurelia felt the Alpha's power wash over her, felt the compulsion that should have driven her to her knees in submission. But instead of overwhelming her will, it seemed to slide off her like water off stone. Through her connection with Lynx, she was borrowing his immunity to such mental manipulations. "No," she said calmly. "I won't." The simple defiance sent ripples of shock through the assembled group. Omegas didn't resist Alpha commands. It was literally impossible. Their nature made them incapable of such rebellion. Unless, of course, they were being protected by something with power greater than an Alpha's. "This ends now," Dominic snarled, drawing his silver blade fully. "If you won't surrender it willingly, we'll take it by force." He lunged forward with the enhanced speed of his Alpha nature, moving faster than human eyes should have been able to track. But Lynx was faster. The great wolf intercepted Dominic's charge with fluid grace, catching the Alpha's wrist in jaws that could have crushed stone, but instead of snapping bone and severing arteries, Lynx applied just enough pressure to stop the attack without causing permanent damage. A warning, not an execution. Dominic dangled helplessly from Lynx's grip, his silver weapon falling forgotten to the ground. And in that moment, with the pack's ultimate authority figure rendered as helpless as a pup in the jaws of something infinitely more powerful, the true balance of power became clear to everyone present. "I think you should leave," Aurelia said quietly. "All of you. And you should stay away." Lynx released the Alpha and stepped back, his golden eyes never leaving Dominic's face. The message was unmistakable. This clemency was a gift, not a right. Next time, there might not be such restraint. "This isn't over," Marcus said as the group retreated down the hill. "The council will hear of this. They'll send hunters." "Let them come," Aurelia replied. "We'll be ready." After they were gone, she sank onto her front steps with trembling legs. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving her acutely aware of how close they'd all come to violence. If Lynx had chosen to truly defend himself, if he'd used the full extent of whatever power flowed through his ancient bloodline. "We can't stay here," she said aloud, more to herself than to him. "They'll be back with reinforcements, silver weapons, maybe even hunters from outside the pack." Lynx padded over to where she sat and rested his massive head in her lap. Through their connection, she felt his response. Not fear or resignation, but something that might have been anticipation. He was ready for whatever came next. The question was whether she could be ready too. That night, as she sat by the fire trying to figure out how an Omega could disappear from pack territory without being tracked down within hours, Lynx did something unprecedented. He spoke, not through their mental connection, not through images and emotions, but with actual words formed by a throat that was learning to shape human sounds. "Aurelia," he said, his voice deep as distant thunder and rough with the effort of forcing unfamiliar syllables through lupine vocal cords. "Time to go home." She looked up from her meager packing to find him watching her with those incredible golden eyes, symbols still flickering in their depths like text written in fire. "Home?" she asked. "Where is home for us now?" His answer came not in words, but in a shared vision so vivid it took her breath away. Mountains that scraped the sky, their peaks crowned with eternal snow, hidden valleys where ancient forests grew in cathedral silence, and rising from the heart of it all, a fortress of black stone that seemed carved from the very bones of the earth itself, the ancestral seat of House Valdris, the place where Lynx's true power lay, waiting to be claimed. "It's still standing?" she whispered in amazement. "Waiting," he replied, the single word carrying weights of meaning that no human language could fully express. Aurelia looked around her tiny cabin, the only real home she'd ever known, humble and poor as it was. Then she looked at Lynx, this incredible creature who had chosen to trust her with his secrets, his power, his very life. "When do we leave?" she asked. His answer was a sound that might have been laughter if wolves were capable of such expressions. Now. The journey began before dawn, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever food she could carry in a small pack. Lynx led the way through forests she'd never seen, following paths that seemed to exist only for him. Sometimes they were actual deer tracks worn into the earth by generations of use. Other times, they were routes that defied logic, straight lines through tangled underbrush that parted before them as if the very forest recognized Lynx's right to passage. They traveled in companionable silence for the most part, communicating through their mental bond when necessary. But as the hours passed and the familiar landmarks of her old life fell away behind them, Aurelia began to understand that this journey was about more than simply escaping pack justice. Lynx was changing. With each mile they covered, she felt his power growing stronger, more focused. The supernatural abilities that had been developing in fits and starts over the past weeks were beginning to stabilize, settling into patterns that spoke of ancient training and inherited knowledge asserting itself. By midday, when they stopped to rest beside a stream she didn't recognize, he had grown again, not just physically, though his size continued to increase at an impossible rate, but in presence. The air around him hummed with barely contained energy, and she found herself struggling to meet his gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. "What's happening to you?" she asked, as they shared the last of her bread beside the rushing water. "Remembering," he replied, the word clearer now as his vocal cords adapted to human speech patterns. "Power. Calls to power. The closer we get, the more I become." "Become what?" His golden eyes met hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "What I was born to be." That night, they sheltered in a cave that Lynx seemed to know, despite having never been in these mountains before. As Aurelia built a small fire for warmth and comfort, she watched him pace the perimeter of their temporary camp with restless energy. He was magnificent now, easily the size of a horse, and radiating such controlled power that she felt safer in this wilderness than she ever had in the supposed security of pack territory. But there was something else building in him too, a distance, a separation that hadn't been there before. "Are you still you?" she asked quietly as he settled beside the fire. "More myself than I have ever been," he replied, "but also more than I was. Will you still need me? When we reach your ancestral home? When you claim your full inheritance?" The question came out smaller than she'd intended, tinged with the fear that had been growing in her heart all day. Lynx turned to look at her with an expression so human it took her breath away. In his eyes, she saw not the alien intelligence of an ancient bloodline, but the same gratitude and affection that had first bonded them together. "Aurelia," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a prayer. "You saved me when I was nothing, believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, fed me from your own mouth when you had nothing to spare." He moved closer, and she felt the warmth of his presence wrapping around her like a protective embrace. "I am Lynx of House Valdris," he continued, his voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of titles and inheritance and power beyond mortal comprehension. "But before that, I am yours, and I will be yours until the stars burn out and the mountains crumble to dust." Tears sprang to her eyes at the fierce conviction in his voice. "Even when you're powerful enough to have anything you want, anyone you want, I want you," he said simply. "I choose you. Not because you're an Omega without other options, but because you have a heart brave enough to love a monster and a spirit strong enough to stand against those who would destroy what they don't understand." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "We're going to change everything, Aurelia. The old bloodlines will rise again, but this time they won't rule through fear. They'll remember what it means to protect those who can't protect themselves. And you will be the bridge between what we were and what we can become." As she fell asleep that night with Lynx's warmth surrounding her, Aurelia felt the future unfurling before them like a banner in the wind. There would be challenges ahead, forces that would try to stop them from reaching their destination. But there would also be wonders beyond her ability to imagine. She had saved a wolf pup for 5 copper coins. In return, he was going to give her the world. The Valdris ancestral fortress rose from the heart of the mountain, like something carved from a titan's dream. Aurelia stood at the edge of the hidden valley, her breath forming silver clouds in the thin air, and stared up at walls of black stone that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Towers twisted toward the sky in impossible spirals, their peaks crowned with crystalline structures that caught and bent the sunlight into patterns that made her eyes water to follow. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever seen. "How is it still standing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the peaks around them. "If your family was destroyed 300 years ago, stone remembers," Lynx replied, his voice now fully human despite the lupine form he maintained. Over the past week of travel, his ability to speak had developed at the same impossible rate as everything else about him. "And some stones are older than the grudges of wolves." He had grown again during their final approach to the mountains, his frame now so massive that Aurelia barely reached his shoulder when she walked beside him. But it was the changes in his bearing that truly marked his transformation. The playful, grateful creature she had rescued was still there beneath the surface, but overlaying it now was something regal and ancient. A presence that spoke of bloodlines stretching back to the very dawn of their kind. The silver tracery in his fur had spread and deepened, forming complex patterns that seemed to shift and flow when she wasn't looking directly at them. And his eyes had become windows into depths of power and knowledge that made her dizzy to contemplate. Yet when he looked at her, she still saw the same devotion that had first bound them together. If anything, his feelings toward her had intensified as his true nature asserted itself, as if his growing power only made him more aware of what her kindness had meant to him. "How do we get inside?" she asked, studying the sheer walls that surrounded the fortress. There was no visible entrance, no road or path leading to gates that might admit them. Lynx padded forward to where a section of the valley wall seemed unmarked by any human construction. But as he approached, symbols began to glow beneath his paws. Ancient script, carved so deeply into the stone that it had survived centuries of weather and neglect. "Lynx of House Valdris," he said formally, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very bones of the mountain. "Last heir of the Northern Crown, keeper of the old laws, guardian of the deep magic. I have returned to claim my inheritance." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, a harmonic thrumming that built from barely perceptible tremor to symphony of stone and earth. The symbols under Lynx's paws blazed with silver fire, spreading outward in intricate networks that traced themselves across the valley floor, like veins of liquid starlight. Then, with a sound like the world itself taking a deep breath, the mountain opened. A section of what had appeared to be solid stone folded inward upon itself, revealing a tunnel lined with the same black material as the fortress walls. Light bloomed within, not the harsh glare of flame or electric illumination, but something softer and more ethereal, as if the stones themselves were pleased to welcome their returning lord. "The mountain recognizes you," Aurelia breathed in amazement. "The mountain and I are old friends," Lynx replied, a note of something like humor in his voice. "My ancestors didn't simply build their fortress here, they became part of it, and it became part of them." As they walked through the tunnel that led into the heart of the mountain, Aurelia began to understand what he meant. The walls around them weren't merely carved stone, they were living architecture, responding to Lynx's presence with subtle shifts of color and texture that spoke of awareness and intelligence. Veins of crystal ran through the black rock, pulsing with gentle light that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. "How many of you were there?" she asked, running her fingers along a wall that felt warm to the touch, despite being buried deep within the mountain. "Before the other packs destroyed your family?" Not as many as they feared, Lynx said quietly. Perhaps 50 adults, another 30 children. We were never numerous. Our bloodline traded quantity for quality, breeding for power rather than population. And now there's just you. Now there's just me. The words carried a weight of loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. The last of a line that traced its heritage back to the first wolves who learned to think and speak and dream of more than simple survival. They emerged from the tunnel into a vast circular chamber that took Aurelia's breath away. The space was large enough to house a cathedral, its walls rising to heights that vanished into shadow above them. But it was the contents of the chamber that truly stunned her. Books. Thousands upon thousands of books, their spines glowing with the same gentle illumination that had guided their path, arranged on shelves that spiraled up the walls in impossible helixes that seemed to defy gravity. The archive, Lynx explained, his voice hushed with reverence. The accumulated knowledge of 3,000 years of lycanthrope history, magic, politics, genealogies, prophecies, and secrets that could reshape the supernatural world if they fell into the wrong hands. Aurelia turned slowly, trying to take in the scope of the collection. This is why they really wanted your family destroyed, isn't it? Not because you were tyrants, but because you knew too much. Knowledge is power, Lynx agreed. And power that isn't controlled by the existing hierarchy is seen as a threat to be eliminated. He padded to the center of the chamber, where a raised dais held what appeared to be an altar carved from a single massive crystal. The surface of the stone was covered in the same ancient script that had opened the mountain, but these symbols were different somehow, deeper, more complex, humming with barely contained energy. The heart of the house, Lynx said, his voice taking on formal cadences, where the power of each generation was passed from parent to child, where the memories and abilities of our ancestors wait to be claimed by their inheritor. Is that what happens now? Aurelia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. You claim your inheritance and become, what? A god among wolves? Lynx turned to look at her, his golden eyes gentle despite the power that burned within them. I become what I was always meant to be. But Aurelia, he moved closer, lowering his massive head until they were eye to eye. I need you to understand something. What happens here will change me. Not in my feelings toward you. Those will never change, but in my capabilities. I will become something that exists beyond the normal bounds of lycanthrope society. Something the other packs will try to destroy again. Something they will fear to challenge directly, he corrected, but also something they will spend every moment scheming to undermine. The life we've lived for the past months, hiding and running and pretending to be less than we are, that's over. From this moment forward, we'll be targets. Constantly. Aurelia looked around at the impossible library, at the living architecture that responded to Lynx's presence like a faithful servant, at the altar where power beyond imagination waited to be claimed. Then she looked back at him, this creature who had grown from a frightened pup into something legendary in the span of mere months. I've been a target my whole life just for being an Omega, she said quietly. At least this time, I'll be standing beside someone who can protect the both of us. His response was a sound that might have been laughter if wolves were capable of such expressions. Protect you? Aurelia, by the time this is over, you're going to be far more dangerous than I am. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, he padded to one of the lower shelves and carefully extracted a volume bound in what looked like silver wire and midnight blue leather. When he brought it to her, she could feel power radiating from the book itself, as if the words within were alive and eager to be read. The Chronicle of Bonds, he explained. The record of every significant pairing in Valdris history, every mate chosen, every alliance forged, every partnership that shaped our bloodline's destiny. Aurelia opened the book with trembling hands and found page after page of elegant script detailing relationships that spanned centuries. Some were political arrangements, others love matches, but all were documented with meticulous care and obvious respect for the individuals involved. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because you need to understand what's about to happen. Lynx moved to stand beside her, his presence warm and reassuring even as his words sent chills down her spine. When I claim my inheritance, when the power of my ancestors flows through me and awakens abilities that have been sleeping in my blood, it will create a bond between us. Not just the emotional connection we already share, but something deeper, something permanent. What kind of bond? The kind that makes two separate beings into something greater than the sum of their parts. His voice grew soft, almost reverent. The Valdris bloodline didn't maintain its power through strength alone, Aurelia. We maintained it through partnerships. Every heir found their complement, their perfect balance. Someone whose strengths covered their weaknesses, whose heart anchored their power in wisdom rather than ambition. Understanding began to dawn, along with a flutter of fear that had nothing to do with physical danger. You're saying I would become like you, powerful. I'm saying you already are like me, he corrected gently. You just don't know it yet. Why do you think an Omega was able to see through the deceptions that fooled an entire pack? Why were you the only one who could touch me without fear when I was hidden in that traitor's cart? Why has my power been drawn to yours since the moment we met? Aurelia stared down at the Chronicle, at the stories of partnerships that had shaped lycanthrope history for millennia. I'm not special, she whispered. I'm nobody. A failed shifter who can't even transform properly. You're the missing piece of my soul, Lynx said simply. And I'm the key that will unlock everything you were meant to be. He padded back to the crystal altar and looked at her with an expression that was both invitation and question. The choice is yours, Aurelia. Always yours. You can walk away now, and I'll ensure you have a safe place to live far from any who would harm you. But if you stay, if you choose to stand with me as I claim my inheritance, then there will be no going back. You'll become something the world hasn't seen for 300 years. What would that be, exactly? The Lady of House Valdris, my mate in power as well as heart, the bridge between the old bloodlines and the new world they must learn to navigate. Aurelia closed the Chronicle and set it carefully aside, her hands no longer trembling. The fear was still there, but underneath it burned something stronger, a sense of rightness, of destiny finally clicking into place, after a lifetime of feeling like she was playing the wrong part in someone else's story. If I do this, she said slowly, what happens to the people who treated us both like monsters? The pack leadership that wanted to kill you before you could threaten their authority? Lynx's smile was sharp as winter wind. We remind them what it means to stand against the old bloodlines. And then we build something better in the ruins of their failures. It wasn't quite a promise of revenge, but it was close enough to satisfy the part of her heart that had been hurt and dismissed and degraded for far too long. Show me what I need to do, she said. The ritual was unlike anything Aurelia could have imagined. Lynx approached the crystal altar with movements that spoke of ceremonies remembered in blood and bone, ancestral knowledge awakening as he drew closer to the source of his family's power. The symbols carved into the crystal began to glow as he neared them, pulsing with rhythms that seemed to match the beating of her own heart. Place your hands here, he instructed, indicating a section of the altar where the stone was worn smooth by generations of touch. And whatever you see, whatever you feel, don't pull away. The power has to recognize you as willingly chosen, not claimed by force. Aurelia pressed her palms against the crystal and gasped as energy immediately began flowing up her arms. It wasn't painful, exactly, but it was overwhelming, like being caught in a river of liquid starlight that carried within it the memories and experiences of countless lives lived in service to something greater than personal ambition. She saw Valdris ancestors stretching back through centuries, each generation adding their wisdom and strength to the legacy that Lynx was about to inherit. Warriors and scholars, healers and leaders, all united by a common understanding that true power came not from domination, but from protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. Now, Lynx said, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. Now I claim what was always mine. He reared up on his hind legs and placed his massive paws on the altar beside her hands. The moment their skin touched the crystal simultaneously, the world exploded into light. Power rushed through them both with the force of a tsunami, carrying within it abilities and knowledge that no mortal mind should have been able to contain. Aurelia felt her consciousness expanding, touching thoughts and memories that belonged to bloodlines stretching back to the very origins of lycanthrope civilization. She understood suddenly why the other packs had feared the Valdris family, not because they were tyrants, but because they remembered what wolves had been before politics and hierarchy reduced them to pale shadows of their true potential. Through the torrent of inherited memory, she felt Lynx changing beside her. His lupine form dissolved and reformed, bones lengthening and reshaping themselves as his body finally achieved the perfect balance between human intelligence and wolf instinct. When the transformation was complete, he stood beside her as a man, tall and powerfully built, with hair the color of winter storms and eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom. But it was the changes in herself that truly took her breath away. The wolf that had been sleeping in her blood since birth finally awakened, not with the violent struggle she remembered from her failed transformation years ago, but with the gentle certainty of something finally coming home. She felt her senses sharpen, her awareness expand, her very presence in the world shift from that of prey to predator. When the light finally faded and she could see clearly again, she found herself looking at her hands in amazement. They appeared unchanged, but she could feel the power flowing through them, not just the enhanced strength and speed of lycanthrope transformation, but something deeper, something that made the very air around her respond to her will. "How do you feel?" Lynx asked, his human voice carrying the same warmth she remembered from their mental connection. Aurelia tested her new awareness, marveling at the way she could suddenly perceive layers of reality that had been invisible to her before. Energy flowed through everything, the living stone of the fortress, the ancient books surrounding them, the mountain itself, and she could touch those flows, direct them, shape them according to her need. "Powerful," she said honestly. "Terrifyingly powerful." "And beautiful," he added, stepping closer. "You're absolutely beautiful." She looked down at herself and gasped. Her simple traveling clothes had been transformed into garments that seemed woven from shadow and starlight, perfectly fitted to her frame and shimmering with their own inner radiance. Her hair had lengthened and darkened, falling in waves that caught and reflected light that wasn't quite there. And when she caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of the altar, she saw eyes that glowed with the same golden fire as Lynx's. "We match," she said wonderingly. "We complement," he corrected. Two halves of a perfect whole. The truth of his words resonated through their enhanced bond. No longer just emotional connection, but something approaching true telepathy. She could feel his thoughts brushing against hers, his relief and joy and fierce protective love warming her from within. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do we stay here, build a new House Valdris in isolation until the world forgets we exist?" Lynx shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Now we go home, back to Silverpine territory, back to the pack that tried to destroy us before we could become what we were meant to be." "That sounds dangerous." "It is dangerous," he agreed cheerfully. "But it's also necessary. The old bloodlines can't remain hidden forever, Aurelia. The supernatural world is changing, evolving into something that will require the wisdom and strength our ancestors possessed. And someone needs to remind the current leadership what they've been missing." She thought about Alpha Dominic and his enforcers, about Elder Morgana and her fear of power that couldn't be controlled, about all the wolves who had dismissed her as worthless, simply because she couldn't shift properly. "When you say remind them," she said carefully, "what exactly do you have in mind?" Lynx's smile widened, revealing teeth that were perhaps a bit too sharp for entirely human features. "A demonstration," he said. "Something that will make it very clear that the old ways of doing things are about to change dramatically. Will anyone be hurt?" "Only their pride," he assured her, "though I suspect that will be painful enough." Aurelia looked around the archive one last time, at the accumulated wisdom of 3 millennia preserved in living stone and crystal light. Tomorrow, they would leave this sanctuary behind and return to a world that had tried to destroy them both. But they wouldn't be returning as the frightened refugees who had fled into the mountains weeks ago. They would be returning as something the supernatural world hadn't seen for 3 centuries, a bonded pair of the old bloodlines, carrying within them powers that could reshape the very foundations of lycanthrope society. "How long do you think it will take them to realize what they're dealing with?" she asked. Lynx considered the question seriously. "About 30 seconds after we walk into the territory," he said. "Maybe less." "And how long after that before they try to kill us again?" "About 31 seconds, he replied cheerfully. "But by then, it will be far too late for them to succeed." As they made their preparations to leave the fortress that had sheltered and transformed them, Aurelia felt a deep sense of completeness settling into her bones. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. She was the lady of House Valdris, mate and complement to the last heir of an ancient bloodline. And together, they were going to change everything. Starting with the pack that had made the mistake of thinking 5 copper coins could buy the loyalty of a legend. 3 days later, they stood once again at the edge of Silverpine territory, But everything had changed. Where once a broken Omega and a frightened pup had fled in desperate hope of survival, now stood two beings whose presence seemed to bend reality around them. Lynx had learned to moderate his appearance, taking human form, but allowing hints of his true nature to show through. The two bright eyes, the two perfect features, the aura of controlled power that made small animals fall silent in his presence. Aurelia had undergone her own transformation, though hers was more subtle. To casual observation, she appeared to be the same woman who had left, perhaps a bit more confident, a bit more graceful, but recognizably herself. It was only when someone looked directly into her eyes that they caught glimpses of the depths now hidden there, the ancient wisdom that had been awakened by her bonding with the old bloodlines. "Are you ready?" Lynx asked, as they looked down at the pack settlement spread below them. Aurelia smiled, feeling power flowing through her veins like liquid starlight. "I've been ready my whole life." Together, they walked down the hill toward their old lives, carrying with them the future of lycanthrope civilization. Behind them, the mountain watched with approval as its children finally came home.